First of all, I just want to say thank you and to express my sincere appreciation for having me here to speak today. It's a tremendous opportunity, and I genuinely appreciate it very much. So yeah, I've been in cybersecurity pretty much my whole life. It's basically the only thing I know how to do. And when this opportunity to speak today was presented, I wanted to deliver a keynote that really captured the challenges of cybersecurity and cyber insurance, because I would say historically they haven't exactly, these two industries, been working hand in hand. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement, and I think there's a significant number of opportunities for the insurance world to make a ton more money, which should excite everybody, I think, in this room. One of my favorite things about giving presentations is deciding upon a title. So I went with the good, the bad, and the risky, which is a play on a common phrase. But I thought it would be fun if we first... Clicker's broken. Oh, there we go. Some rejected keynote titles. These were, solicited amongst the company. We had a little fun with these. So the first one, Cybersecurity, Love and Thunder. It's a Thor reference. I don't know if there's any Marvel fans. Second one, Cyber Plus Insurance, Love Actuary. I'm glad you guys got that one. I didn't get it at first. Next one, Cyber Insurance, the house that should always win. Casino joke. And my favorite, and probably the most relevant but non-suitable, cybersecurity is a confusing, overly complicated industry driven by greedy marketers, which makes it very difficult for cyber insurance to understand risk when helping companies who are being targeted by bad guys, including nation states, warehouse hacking groups, and script kiddies in their basement wearing only their pajamas. That's ultimately the problem. Okay, so I'm a big fan of 3-act presentations, so there's going to be 3 acts to this one. A quick dive into the evolution of cyber insurance. I suspect half of you may be throwing things at me by the end of this, because what I've learned in my career as a cybersecurity professional is going baseline truth is always the best way to go. So I apologize for this first bit if I offend anybody. The next part will dive into the challenges of measuring risk. That seems to be, at least from my perspective as a cybersecurity vendor, your biggest challenge as an industry is really understanding what cybersecurity risk is, how do you measure it, what can you do with it, and how you make things better in the future. And then I'll finish up with, I like to think, an optimistic finale. With some suggestions as to how you could potentially make more money or control things a little bit more than perhaps you currently do. I feel like we need a new battery. Oh, there we are. 2 disclaimers. The first one is this is an SME-focused discussion, not enterprise. So SME stands for small to medium enterprise or business. My experience is in this area. So in the world of enterprises, I have no experience in, so I'm not going to pretend that I do. So anything I say that is contrary to your experience, perhaps delivering cyber insurance to enterprises, I apologize for that. The second thing is this is very cybersecurity centric. I'm by no means an expert in cyber insurance, so if I say something that is completely false, just tell me after. You're not going to hurt my feelings, and again, I apologize if I get it wrong. Okay, so 3 years ago, arbitrary step back in time, but what did the cyber insurance industry look like? And again, this is from a perspective of a cyber vendor. What we saw was an industry going after a very large greenfield opportunity. Clearly, there was a large number of companies that needed protection. Ransomware was becoming more and more prevalent, and also financial redirection attacks. And the industry wanted to help. The problem is there didn't appear to be an understanding of risk or an appreciation of how much risk there actually was in that. And to use an analogy, we often saw people, it would be similar to giving somebody a driver's license without giving them car insurance without even knowing whether they have a driver's license. And there was a lot of policies given to companies that had absolutely no help in actually defending themselves against cyber attacks. And ultimately, I think that is what has led to today, where risk is such a high-profile item. There's also a huge gap in IT team knowledge. So the confidence in whether a company could actually understand the risk or how cyber insurance fit in, it just wasn't there. At the same time, ransomware was on the rise. It was more and more frequent. There were more and more compromises. And I think largely the cybersecurity industry completely dropped the ball in regards to protecting companies. The depressing thing is stopping ransomware is probably the easiest type of attack. And the fact that the cybersecurity industry has been largely terrible at it, I don't have a good explanation for that, but that is the unfortunate reality. The results of what we saw was that cyber insurance ultimately incentivized the attacker. What it gave was basically a guaranteed payday if you could actually compromise a company. And that is a depressing outcome, but that is the reality of what we saw. The other thing we saw is companies did not really know how to gauge whether they needed cyber insurance or cyber security. In a perfect world, they'd get both, but what we heard a lot of was, well, we don't really need cybersecurity because we're covered with cyber insurance, which is ultimately not the case and leads to problems. Luckily, I think today things are getting better. I say that, but the first bullet is kind of depressing. The unfortunate reality is there are more ransomware attacks happening. Maybe not successful, but the number of attacks and the frequency are definitely increasing, in particular since the war broke out in Ukraine. Our customers, we have about 1,000 customers around the world, and we see a considerable number of attacks, which is just the reality we deal with. The risk to cyber insurance companies hasn't really changed, just because there is still that pull of whether to use a cybersecurity provider or not. I think that's getting better, but it's not quite there. And I think what is starting to be a little bit at risk is the value proposition of cyber insurance. The reaction to having to pay out so much money appears to be pulling back on who qualifies or adding additional exclusions. And in reality, that might seem like a great idea on the surface because that is hopefully a measurable thing from the insurance industry's perspective. But it's actually much more challenging than everybody may realize. So the next part I'm going to talk about is some recommendations, but I'm going to start out specifically focusing on state-sponsored attacks and whether you can realistically measure those or not and understand those and identify those. You guys aren't going to like the answer. So there's two big challenges with identifying an attacker, i.e. a hacker on the other side of the world or perhaps next door to you. The first is identifying geolocation, and that could be a country, a building, but just to get an idea of who that actual attacker is. Typically, this is a highly underestimated challenge simply because it comes down to visibility. For you to understand where an attack is coming from, you need to be able to view network traffic across the world, theoretically. So even law enforcement agencies have a hard time with this because they have no way to view this type of activity around the world. That is a challenge that if the cyber insurance industry wishes to understand whether it's a state-sponsored attacker or not, your visibility is very, very limited. In addition to that, if you do have a few hops of coverage, you're still dealing with obfuscation techniques or ways that attackers can actually hide their tracks. And that's something that is very, very challenging. It's like driving a car with a mask over your face. It's very difficult to navigate what is happening. And another example is, does everybody remember the SolarWinds breach in 2020? Yeah. So the tough thing with this type of supply chain attack is it creates separation from time of attack to the symptom of the attack. And this is going to be something that happens more and more frequently, where a compromise takes place in a supply chain. It's there for years, and then it's actually activated further down the road. That creates a large period of time that is very difficult to trace back to. So the first point of trying to find out where the attacker is, extremely difficult. Intelligence agencies have a hard time with this. So the insurance industry will certainly have a hard time with this. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge is the characteristics of the attacks, so of the malware or the ransomware. I think there's a false misconception in the world due to all the reports that people see about identifying like Frisky Panda or another hacking group that are identified and are confidently called out in their various attacks. These are nation-state actors that have gained notoriety. The reality is the vast majority of attacks aren't of this category. We've been in market for about 4 years now. Knock on wood, we've never had a breach. But any time we have seen an attack, it has never been from a nation state, and it's never involved a high-grade exploit. What that means, it is attacks from low-grade attackers that are the bigger problem for small to medium businesses. So focusing on on nation states might not get you the desired results. Now, when it comes to the characteristics of the actual software that they're using, malware, ransomware, whatever, there's a shrinking distance between the technical capabilities of a nation state and somebody working out of their basement. There's several reasons for this, but it's just the trend that is happening. One reason for this are technology leaks that have happened over the years from intelligence agencies. And an example is a tool called Eternal Blue. It was a tool used by NSA very prevalently throughout the world for NSA's notorious hacking activities. Unfortunately, in 2017, a group called Shadow Brokers were able to attain those tools and release those to the world. And that gave way to the NotPetya ransomware attack. Now, before that, ransomware technology looked entirely different. This new bit of disruptive, for lack of a better word, intelligence-grade technology entering into the ransomware market completely changed things. And it basically shrunk that distance between the capabilities of an intelligence agency and the capabilities of ransomware actors. And where we are today is, ironically, intelligence agencies try to look like low-grade attackers, and low-grade attackers try to look like intelligence agencies. So the line between what is very definitive nation-state technology versus what is not is blurry and very difficult to make sense of. The other thing is, thinking about the motivation of an attacker. If the insurance world adopts the exclusion that nation-states, you're not going to get paid if a nation-state causes damage to your company, what will happen is everybody will try to look like a low-grade attacker. Ransomware actors want to get paid, and if this is a blocker, they'll find a way around it. It is just the reality of how good hackers, unfortunately, are. They're lazy, but they're quite good. So my strong recommendation moving forward is part of your risk calculation. I would highly recommend you do not focus on the attacker type, because it will not be something that ends up working in your favor. And I would be concerned that fast forward 2 years, there's false confidence put into this type of exclusion, when in reality, attackers find a way around it. Or the difficulty to identify nation state leads to litigation and various other drawbacks. So I would not recommend doing that. I think I've covered most of this, so I'm going to move on. The next recommendation, this is more on the preventative side. Prevention in cybersecurity is by far the best way to go. So what I recommend to this body is support and focus on cybersecurity frameworks. These are the frameworks that have been designed by cybersecurity experts around the world when designing network security programs or policies. The number of companies that we see come to us because they've been hacked, it's always because they didn't get the basics right. And these types of frameworks get those basics right. It gives you, checklists, things to follow, regular reviews. So things like the NIST cybersecurity framework or ISO 27001. Both of those are suitable frameworks that, if I were this body, I would require customers of cyber insurance to comply with one of these frameworks. It is I think, a very reasonable ask on your part to do so. And I think it's something that naturally encourages the world to be better at cybersecurity and for the customer to own the problem, not just get insurance and just assume everything is fine. The cost of prevention is significantly less than recovering from a cyber attack. 82%, according to that stat, the link there at the bottom, of cyber attacks are now on SMEs, and SMEs are by far the most underprotected group out there. The next stat there, that the cost of prevention is for 1 year is 25% less than a breach. Truthfully, it was very difficult to pull out, statistics on cyber breaches and how much they cost and the frequency of. I used the baseline of $100,000 as a payout because that seemed to be the smaller end, and the cost of cyber security being about $25,000 a year for a company. In reality, depending on company size, it can be as small as $5,000, $3,000. It really depends. So my point in that is that the cost of prevention is significantly less than the cost of a payout, which lines up ideally with, I think, the approach that the industry, insurance industry, should be taking to understand the risk when giving policies. There is some positive momentum in this area. These are 10 guidelines from a paper by ANG. They're an industry analyst group out of the US. These are common things that cyber insurance companies are now starting to ask for, and I think this is a really good start. That if companies had some of these mechanisms in place, maybe not all of them, but even some, in order to give a policy, I think that's a really good step forward. So it gives you something to, I guess, to fall back on when deciding whether a company qualifies or not. So I just wanted to make note of that. The next thing is to align with governments. There's been a tremendous amount of work in putting forth policies or frameworks that will penalize companies that do not protect customer data or do not take privacy seriously. I think the most famous is GDPR, which covers, I think, the vast majority of Europe. These are actually really good frameworks, and even though they do not align with, or they do not specify how to implement good cybersecurity, they are an incentivizer for companies to take that problem seriously. Because if a breach happens and they have not taken it seriously, there are things like economic penalties, company directors can be penalized, and it's the type of motivator that if you're a company and you have to comply with these frameworks, you'll take seriously. Otherwise, there could literally, it could be a company-ending event. So I don't necessarily have the how you would align with these types of frameworks, but I would endorse them and use them as an incentivization for companies that are looking to get cyber insurance. Okay, the future is cyber attack bit. We're in the third act. I know I'm going a little bit long. I apologize. Even if ransomware gets entirely squashed, which I don't think it will, intellectual property theft is, I think, a more persistent problem that has been around for much longer, that has lost focus. The reason for that is ransomware attacks are very tangible. They're something that you feel immediately as a company and you have to respond and recover from. When in reality, the intellectual property theft vector is something that I think is much more impactful to a company, to an industry, or to a country. This is the attack where an attacker will reside in your network, steal your intellectual property, sell it to a competing company, or to a competing nation. And I think this type of attack, even if the ransomware problem is entirely solved, will persist. Insider threats will very likely have an increasing focus because of the current instability, I guess, around the world. So things like recessions that are looming, depending on what country you're in, things like inflation, it all puts pressure on people, and the war in Ukraine. So what is really boiling is a scenario where the opportunity to bribe people, the success ratio or rate of bribing people who are in specific roles increases. And that's a huge threat because measuring insider threats and controlling it, extremely difficult. The example that I like to use is the disgruntled IT administrator, which, does anybody know an IT person that isn't disgruntled? I had a laugh after I wrote that. But it's the type of role in your company that has complete visibility and control over your network. And if somebody is to bribe one of these people and get them onto their side, it's really, really tough to detect that and stop that. Supply chain threats, I think, are going to continue into the future. They're really good, putting on my spy tradecraft hat. I'm at awe at the technical ability that goes into these types of attacks. On the bright side, I don't see them being carried out by anything other than nation states. So if you're looking for that definitive check mark, that might be a type of vector that you only see with nation states. But as I said, the downside of these attacks is they take years to prepare and set up, and then once they're implemented, they have a mass effect. So I don't, unfortunately, see those attacks going away anytime soon. Damage-only attacks are the type where it's basically an attack on infrastructure, perhaps trying to damage computers. Stuxnet, I'm sure several people in this room have heard of, was an attack on Iranian infrastructure by the US government a long time ago that messed with nuclear centrifuges or uranium centrifuges. These types of attacks are unfortunately quite easy, especially on IoT devices. So it requires a lower level of tradecraft, and those will probably be more prevalent in the future. I'm going to end on a positive note here. AI-driven attacks, probably not going to be a thing. If you ever talk with a cybersecurity vendor and they try to sell you on the future of malware being all driven by AI, highly, highly unlikely. There's two reasons for that. The first is really good machine learning, neural nets, or whatever AI bundle you want to classify them as. It requires data, and it requires a good feedback loop. That means that this process of success and failure needs to be measurable, and then that data set that drives that machine learning improves over time. In the world of hacking, malware, you don't have data sets like that. When you try to make an attack and it fails, it's the lights out. You don't get any feedback loop. So the relevance of this type of technology in the malware space is not that high. The second thing is malware authors are generally lazy like you would not believe. They're very, very talented, but once they get the win, they go to bed and they're done. So I don't have a lot of confidence that the world's malware authors will really put time into this. So, I hope I'm not wrong, but I think we have at least a 10-year period before somebody cracks that nut. So future opportunities. If I were in your shoes, I would be looking at how do we commercialize risk reduction? How do we build better relationships with the cybersecurity vendors? I think, wearing my cybersecurity vendor hat, and speaking on behalf of my entire industry, I think that we would jump at the opportunity to be a part of a framework that is driven by the insurance industry. Right now, it is very difficult in making the case to an average company that doesn't know about cybersecurity or how cyber insurance works. But I think there's a huge opportunity for people in this room to make that happen. What that would look like is you would have a vendor-neutral framework that would allow companies to be lined up with potential cybersecurity vendors, and then on top of that, take a percentage of the actual money that a cybersecurity vendor brings in. I think you can actually make more money than you do with your actual cyber insurance premiums. And I'm not kidding. I think there's huge opportunity to build this type of structure. So I'll leave that there. And I think overall, the people in this room have the opportunity to be that driving force that defines how cybersecurity and how cyber insurance work better in the future. Because I think there's, it's obviously better for companies and customers around the world if our two industries work together as best we can. Thank you very much.
Could you hear me now? There we go. Hello, everyone. And first of all, thank you, Matt. Thank you very much for not only a very interesting presentation, but also a very entertaining and engaging one. And also for some very strong messages there. So I suspect we will have plenty of questions from the audience. If not, I have some as well. But let's open up for some Q&A. I think we have about 10-15 minutes for questions. Who would like to go first? Is that Hugh? Great.
Yeah, thanks very much, Matt. That was really interesting. I'm Hugh France with Aviva. The two often key concerns of insurers are cited as lack of data knowledge and accumulation risk. In terms of the data, how fast-moving in practice on the SMEs are they, or do you see repeats of the type of people who are attacking in terms of methodology? And secondly, in relation to accumulation risks, how far is it in the SME market actually hitting a number of people at the same time, but I think those are two concerns, that you get hit, you don't understand what's going on, it's too fast moving, and then secondly on accumulation, that if you get hit across the board with a group you're insuring, you've got, a bit like a pandemic, you have a real issue. So I wonder what your on those two issues were.
Unfortunately, not really good news on either of those either of those areas. The first one, we see repeated attacks all the time. The way we monitor our customers is we can detect an attack, stop an attack, they're notified. And in particular, with the Ukraine war, we've seen a big increase in the frequency of those attacks. So I don't think the failure necessarily deters the attacker. I've also seen cases where a company comes to us and needs help, we provide them incident response, paid for, unfortunately, by a cyber insurance company, and then it's always our mission to protect customers and offer them the service. They say no, and they come back 6 months later with the same attack. I've seen that happen 3 times in a row within a 12-month span, and it's pretty depressing. I would say that's an outlier, because typically when people get hit once with this ransomware attack, they'll learn their lesson. But I would say the repeatability is definitely a problem. We have also seen attacks across industry as well, and geographic regions a bit. So we do a lot of work in the medical field, and if we're protecting one hospital, we'll see commonalities of attacks, and often comes down to the wire. When a new type of attack comes out, we signature it and get things, updated signatures out to the rest of our customers. Like, it is incredible how quickly they move, and the parallel nature that attackers can move.
Thank you. Second question? Petra, please.
Yeah, so thanks a lot for a great presentation. I much enjoyed it. The question I have, because you talked a lot about ransomware and how you could assess the risk to provide that insurance, I was wondering, do you have any views on to what extent having more of this insurance available actually encourages these hackers who like to get paid to continue in this particular area of cybercrime?
I think it makes a huge difference in incentivizing the attacker, because it essentially defines what the gold medal is when they win the race, and what the reward is. I don't know if making it a smaller payout will have a difference in whether ransomware attacks occur more or less. But in negotiations, it's the weirdest thing actually being part of a negotiation for ransomware. We have seen ransomware actors take whatever they can get. So if they come in saying, we want $2 million, if they realize the best they're going to get is $200,000, then they'll take that and go. So there may be an argument that reducing the actual payout, or I don't know what the term for that is, the payout, whatever that be, there might be some some data worth mining to figure out whether that approach is a better way to go to save insurance companies money.
Great. Thank you. Now we have a question at the back.
Thank you for the presentation, Matt. Two questions. You spoke about supply chain, but I'm more interested in third party and outsourcing, because that's typically where we see a lot of the attacks happening, so not the supervised entity themselves, and whether you think they are prepared enough and whether we can put enough pressure on them to be prepared. And then secondly, do you think there's enough insurance that can be taken for this, because it's so wide? Or, and this is maybe an unfair question, whether you think there should be a mix between insurance and holding additional capital. Thank you.
So the first question around the supply chain attacks and where they're most prevalent is, did I catch that? Yeah. So I think the biggest threats for supply chain attacks are around software that remote management software that's used, or anything that is installed in a wide base. So an example would be a managed service provider that provides IT services to 100 companies. They use software to remotely manage those customers, and that type of software is typically quite trusted by cybersecurity vendors. That is essentially what happened with the SolarWinds attack. That is a type of remote management software, and there have been continued discovered breaches around other vendors of that type. It makes total sense from an attacker standpoint that if you want to hit a large number of targets, then you would utilize a mechanism like that. Another example that we saw recently, actually in Canada, was a chat program. So I don't remember the name of the chat program off the top of my head, but it's a Canadian vendor that installs chat apps onto mobile devices, on your laptop and whatever. And these are trusted bits of software that if you can compromise how they're built, they're another way to access a whole bunch of customers. I don't remember the second question.
With capital, and it had to do with capital, or can you have enough insurance for cyber?
So the question is, I don't know if I quite understand the question. You might be diving into an insurance terminology that I don't quite understand. Is it from can you have too much insurance? Is that the...
Sorry, maybe let me clarify. Because it's so wide, do you believe, because you said you would want to work with the regulators and looking at a framework, but because cyber is so wide, do you really believe that you can have enough insurance to cover for all the eventualities that's possible?
Right. That's a good question. I guess it would depend on how you classify the eventualities. There's, obviously a ransomware attack, which it can be kind of measured. The intellectual property one, I think, is a little bit scarier, because what is the intellectual property to a car dealership versus a software maker versus a medical records company? And how do you quantify the loss around that is, I think, a pretty big challenge that I don't really have a good answer for, aside from it's complex.
Yeah, and I think there may also be some supply side issues around issues of concentration and accumulation risk and so on. I mean, maybe connected a little bit to that. I mean, as insurance supervisors around the table, I think sometimes we hear a message from insurance providers, insurance companies, that because of some of the challenges of cyber risk, in particular the possibility that you may have a systemic threat with cyber risk covering a number of industries and a number of geographies at the same time. If you have a really concerted cyber attack, that this is one of the constraining factors to the extent that private insurance can be provided, and that actually perhaps what is called for is a sort of public-private partnership where governments take on a fair amount of this risk. So I just wondered whether you have any thoughts on this question of whether governments should become involved as the sort of insurer of last resort, and some of the issues that might present. Thanks.
So it's the type of problem I don't know if a government would actually be good at. So defining a pool of money that could be available is one thing. I tend to be skeptical as to whether a government would, and this is no judgment on any specific government, it's just the complexity of the problem. I don't think they would necessarily be the best at. Now, if it was a resource that insurance companies could draw on, then that's one thing. But if it's anything more than that, I think that could introduce a pretty significant bureaucratic overhead that might make it an ineffective outcome. I'll just blame the Canadian government for my pessimism, rightly so. And I think it depending on what the structure of that looks like, it might have the opposite effect of incentivizing particular attack types. And it also seems like it would be a bit of a regional challenge. How would a multinational insurance company build plans where, if they're in 5 different countries and each country has a different approach to that, how does that affect the insurance company?
Thanks. And I think you also pointed earlier to sort of moral hazard problems if it's not accompanied by risk prevention. Do we have time for one more question? Solange, of course.
Hi. Supervisors many times were challenged on measuring how resilient is an institution in terms of cyber. And how resilient a company is difficult to assess. If we just measure how much they invest in cybersecurity, might not be enough. What's the best way in which we can measure how resilient a company is?
That's a great question. I think 2 ways. The nature of what their cybersecurity model looks like is, I think, the first way. The reality is that there's not enough cybersecurity talent in the world. IT teams aren't cybersecurity professionals. So I think you could probably build a model where, how big is the company? An easy check mark. How much IT people do you have? Are you trying to solve the problem internally, or are you outsourcing to experts? I think that's something, I think managed service or security service companies are actually they're really good at what they do. The other thing is whether they adhere to those types of frameworks that I mentioned earlier. So, examples being the NIST cybersecurity framework. That's something that you can get a series of check marks around, and it's either you do or do not comply. ISO 27001 is another one, albeit much more difficult to become compliant. But that's another thing where, even from our perspective, we have had to get it as a company, and as we bid on different size projects, either with enterprise or government, the question is, do you have it or not? So I think those things are pretty measurable as opposed to how much you're actually spending.
Great. I think that's a great finish. And thank you very much, Matt, for some very thought-provoking discussions there. Thank you.